On a Thursday night in February 2003, hundreds of people gathered at a small nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island. They were there to hear live music, drink cheap beer, spend a night out close to home. The band had brought pyrotechnics. Nothing big, just brief fountains of sparks to mark the opening of the set. Seconds after the show began, flames reached the ceiling. The fire spread faster than anyone could react. The entire building was consumed in less than 5 minutes. 100 people died. Another 200 were injured, some burned, others crushed as they tried to escape through blocked exits. There was no fire alarm, no sprinklers, no safety plan. Everything was caught on camera, including the moment when nobody in the crowd realized they were already in a room they wouldn't get out of. The station was not a large venue. From the outside, it looked like a place you'd pass without noticing. It sat just off Cohasset Avenue in West Warwick, Rhode Island, not far from a strip mall and a Dunkin' Donuts. The building was 1 story tall, rectangular, with a small front entrance and a parking lot that filled quickly on show nights. Inside, it felt less like a concert venue and more like a bar that had gradually become something else. The space was long, dimly lit, and divided into 3 main sections: the bar, the stage area, and a pool table section toward the back. On February 20th, 2003, the band Great White was scheduled to perform. They weren't at the top of the charts anymore, but people still remembered their music from the mid-1980s. For some in the crowd, this was a night of nostalgia. For others, it was simply something to do on a Thursday. The flyer had been circulating in local bars and record stores for weeks. Admission was low, the drinks were cheap, and the venue was close enough to home for most of the attendees. Patrons began arriving well before the band. Many of them had been to the station before. They knew the layout. The stage was raised slightly, pressed against the front corner of the building, with limited space between the crowd and the performers. The walls were lined with foam insulation to help with the acoustics. It looked like a permanent feature, but in reality, much of it had been installed quickly and cheaply. It wasn't fire-resistant. No one had inspected it properly. Few even noticed it. By 10:30 p.m., the building was full. Some estimates would later say over 460 people were inside. Official occupancy, according to fire codes, was closer to 300. The bar area was busy, and the front of the stage was packed with fans waiting for the band to come on. There were exits, but they weren't obvious. One was behind the stage, rarely used. Another was at the far end of the bar. The main entrance, through which most had come in, was narrow and partially blocked by a coat check station. A local news crew was inside the club that night. A reporter and camera operator had been filming earlier as part of a segment on nightclub safety. A coincidence that would later make them some of the only people to capture the event on tape as it happened. The footage was intended for a small local audience. It would end up being shown in courtrooms, fire safety training, and documentaries for decades to come. Great White took the stage around 11:05 p.m. The crowd was already pressed in close. There were cheers, drinks held up, and the opening chords of Desert Moon. Seconds into the song, pyrotechnics ignited behind the band, 4 small devices shooting sparks upward and outward. The sparks hit the ceiling, then the walls. Within moments, the foam insulation that lined both surfaces began to catch. At first, most people didn't notice. Some thought it was part of the act. The flames on the wall were visible, but small. They seemed contained. The music continued. People kept watching the stage. There was no alarm, no overhead sprinkler system, no announcement. What started as a visual effect turned into active fire in less than 20 seconds. The flames moved along the walls quickly, feeding on the highly flammable foam. As the fire reached the ceiling, it ignited more material. Smoke began to thicken. Lights flickered. The air changed. By the time people realized what was happening, it was already too late to respond calmly. At 11:07 p.m., just seconds after Great White began their opening song, the pyrotechnic devices positioned behind the band were activated. The fountains of sparks shot upward, in arcs that lasted no more than 15 seconds. These were small-scale effects, commonly used in clubs and indoor venues. The kind that are meant to impress but not alarm. The sparks made contact with the acoustic foam panels that line the walls on both sides of the stage. That foam, which had not been fire-rated, ignited almost immediately. The flames climbed vertically and then laterally, following the seams of the foam up the corners of the room and across the ceiling tiles. Within 20 seconds, the fire was no longer decorative or confined. It was spreading visibly and aggressively. The band stopped playing. At first, the audience was still standing in place. Some people near the stage moved back, but most didn't. It wasn't yet clear how serious the fire was, and there was no official response. No one made an announcement. There was no alarm. Most people in the crowd were unaware that the foam lining the walls and ceiling could act like fuel. They had seconds to make decisions, and almost none of them realized how little time they had. The video footage, captured by the WPRI-TV news crew, shows smoke beginning to thicken over the stage. Flames moved across the top edge of the wall behind the band, then advanced toward the ceiling tiles. The smoke turned black as insulation, paint, and synthetic materials began to burn. Visibility dropped rapidly. Breathing became difficult. By the time people began moving toward the exits, two things were already working against them. First, the club was overcrowded. More than 460 people had entered a space that should have held no more than 300. Second, many of the exit doors were either obstructed or unfamiliar to most of the crowd. The front entrance, which doubled as the main exit, quickly became overwhelmed. As people surged toward it, the hallway narrowed into a choke point, trapping bodies in a confined space. Smoke filled the room within 1 minute. Heat intensified. People who were still near the bar or pool table section, farther from the stage, were now rushing forward. Some reached side exits and got out. Others followed the crowd toward the front, unsure where the other doors were or whether they were open. Within 2 minutes, visibility inside the club was almost gone. Flames were now racing along the ceiling, igniting the overhead foam, plastic light covers, and wooden beams. The temperature inside the main room was rising rapidly. Estimates from fire investigators later placed it above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Survivors described the feeling as instant. One moment they could see and breathe, the next they could not. Some people fell. Others tripped over chairs, tables, and each other. In the darkness, orientation was lost. There were no emergency lights, no voice instructions. The only sounds were screaming, glass breaking, and the roar of fire moving through oxygen. 3 people made it out through a stage-side exit. That door had been partially hidden by curtains and was unfamiliar to most guests. One of the guitarists broke through it and escaped along with 2 others. But the majority of the crowd moved toward the front door, the same narrow hallway they had entered through. That space quickly became impassable. Witnesses outside watched the smoke pour through the building. Some tried to re-enter to help, but were driven back by heat and toxic air. In less than 3 minutes, the fire had overtaken the main room. Those who had not exited by then had almost no chance of surviving. The fire department received the first 911 call at 11:08 p.m. Units were dispatched immediately. The first engine arrived less than 6 minutes after the fire began. But by then, the damage had already been done. At 11:08 p.m., just over 1 minute after the pyrotechnics were set off, the first emergency calls began coming into the Kent County Dispatch Center. Several were placed simultaneously, some from inside the club, others from people in the parking lot. Callers reported flames, smoke, and people trying to escape through a crowded front entrance. One caller simply said, "The station is on fire," and hung up. The first engine company from the West Warwick Fire Department was dispatched within seconds. Rescue units and additional fire engines followed immediately. The fire station was less than 2 miles from the Station Nightclub. Under normal road conditions, that meant a response time of less than 5 minutes. But by the time the first engine pulled into the parking lot, the fire had already consumed most of the interior. The scene that greeted first responders was chaotic. Thick smoke was rolling from the building. Flames were clearly visible through the roof line. A crowd had gathered outside, some injured, some in shock, some screaming. Several people were trying to go back inside, shouting that their friends or family were still trapped. Firefighters had to physically hold people back to stop them from running into the smoke. At the front entrance, bodies were already piled several layers deep. In the rush to escape, dozens of people had converged on the main hallway, where the front door sat at the end of a narrow passage. That corridor, just over 6 feet wide, had turned into a bottleneck within the first minute of evacuation. People at the back had pushed forward, not realizing those at the front had nowhere left to go. Some had tripped, others had fallen over them. By the time responders arrived, the doorway had become a mass of bodies, many already unconscious, some crushed, others overcome by smoke. Firefighters began pulling people out immediately. One man was found alive near the bottom of the pile, still breathing barely. 2 others regained consciousness as they were dragged to open air. But most did not. The temperature inside the building had already peaked. The heat had caused flashover, a condition where everything combustible ignites almost at once. Any area still occupied had become lethal within seconds. At the rear and side walls of the building, firefighters tried to gain entry through secondary doors. Some of these were blocked or chained. Others were sealed shut by the fire's pressure differential. Crews used tools to pry open doors and windows, but most areas were already fully engulfed. Visibility was near zero. Protective gear allowed brief entries, but not deep searches. Flames had reached the roof supports. The structure was beginning to fail. Outside, triage began immediately. Survivors with burns were laid out on the pavement and grass, their clothes cut away to treat injuries. Some had third-degree burns on more than half their bodies. Others had severe smoke inhalation or traumatic injuries from the crush at the exits. More than 24 people were taken to Kent County Memorial Hospital within the first 30 minutes. Others were transported by mutual aid to nearby cities. The scene quickly expanded. By midnight, more than 200 first responders were on site, including firefighters, EMTs, police officers, and search and rescue teams from surrounding towns. News of the fire spread rapidly, first by word of mouth, then by television, as WPRI's footage aired live before midnight. Families who had heard about the concert began arriving, searching for names, answers, anyone who could confirm who had made it out. But confirmation came slowly. Many of the bodies inside were burned beyond recognition. Identifying victims took days. Families waited in hospitals and parking lots with lists of names, sometimes holding photographs, hoping for information that wouldn't come quickly. In several cases, loved ones had been standing only feet apart when the fire started and never saw each other again. By sunrise, the fire was out. The building was gone. Just the concrete slab remained. The death toll stood at 96, with more than 180 people injured. For more victims would die in the weeks that followed. The station had not been designed as a nightclub. Originally built in 1946 as a restaurant, the single-story structure was later converted into a bar and music venue. It was never significantly redesigned for large indoor crowds. Over time, new features were added, a raised stage, wall insulation, lighting rigs, but there was no full architectural overhaul. The space grew into its function informally, not through regulation but through repetition. It was used because it was there, not because it was suited for what it had become. When Michael and Jeffrey Derderian purchased the station in 2000, the building had already served as a small concert venue for years. They took over with plans to keep that model in place. Live music, drinks, cover charges, and mostly local crowds. On paper, nothing looked unusual. They submitted occupancy plans, obtained a liquor license, and operated within the basic boundaries of state and municipal oversight. But oversight was limited. Fire code inspections were inconsistent. Changes inside the building, like the addition of polyurethane foam for soundproofing, were never formally documented in permit files. That foam, especially the type used on the walls and ceiling near the stage, was extremely flammable. It was chosen because it was cheap, not because it was safe. It had been installed in 2002 after complaints about noise spilling into the surrounding neighborhood. No fire marshal had reviewed it after installation. The foam came in two forms, one egg crate shaped, one flat. Neither was rated for commercial interior use. When burned, they produced thick black smoke, high levels of carbon monoxide and cyanide gas, a lethal combination. The material ignited easily and burned fast. It was never treated with flame retardant. No one tested it. No one questioned it. In addition to the foam, the layout of the building posed its own risks. The front door, the same one used for entry and exit, led into a narrow corridor that bent slightly before reaching the main room. In the dark and under pressure, that bend caused disorientation. Guests unfamiliar with the layout had no clear view of alternate exits. The club had a side door near the bar, a rear exit by the kitchen, and a stage right door partially obscured by curtains and band equipment. None were marked clearly. Some weren't used by patrons at all. Fire alarms were not installed. There were no sprinklers. Under Rhode Island law at the time, clubs of the station's size weren't required to have them. The law applied to buildings with capacities over 300. The station's official occupancy limit was listed at 404, but inspectors had informally allowed more, and enforcement was lax. In practice, no one counted. In 2002, a fire marshal did conduct a site visit. He noted several potential issues, including exit signs that weren't illuminated, but ultimately allowed the venue to continue operations. He did not raise concerns about the foam, which he later said he had not recognized as dangerous at the time. The band Great White had used pyrotechnics before, but on a smaller scale. In some clubs, they cleared it in advance. In others, they didn't. For the station show, the Durderians later said they were never told about the plan to use indoor fireworks. The band's tour manager claimed he had received verbal permission. There was no permit, no written record. The result was a room lined with combustible materials, packed beyond safe capacity, and filled with people who had no warning, no route guidance, and no chance once the fire began to spread. And yet, until the night of February 20th, 2003, nothing about the station had triggered major concern. It had functioned that way for years, full, familiar, and unprepared. For many of the people who survived the fire at the station, the decision that saved their life was made in the first 15 seconds after the flames appeared. Not everyone saw the fire right away. People standing farther back, near the bar or along the pool tables, didn't realize what was happening until others began shouting. Even then, many assumed it was a small incident, something technical, maybe something the venue staff could handle. One survivor, Gina Russo, had come to the concert with her fiancé, Fred. They had found a place near the front of the stage before the band started. When the pyrotechnics ignited and the flames reached the ceiling foam, they still didn't move. Russo would later say that it took her a few seconds to register that the fire was real. By the time they turned to leave, the crowd had already begun to shift. She and Fred were separated. She made it out. He didn't. Others reacted immediately. Some saw the flame hit the ceiling and moved straight toward the nearest side exit. For those who were closest to those doors and acted fast, escape was possible. A man named Joe Kinnan was one of the last people to make it through the main bar area before the fire reached full flashover. He was burned over more than 40% of his body. He spent months in a coma and underwent dozens of surgeries. He survived, but almost everyone behind him in the crowd did not. The stage right exit, behind a curtain partially blocked by equipment, was used by only a handful of people. Band members, including guitarist Ty Longley, tried to get out that way. Longley didn't make it. His body was later found inside the building. Others in the band escaped out the back, including the tour manager and lead singer Jack Russell. They assumed the fire would be extinguished quickly. By the time they realized how fast it was moving, most of the crowd was already trapped. People who reached the front entrance found themselves stuck in a crowd that couldn't move. Dozens tried to push through the corridor at once. Those in the back had no view of what was happening ahead. They didn't know people were falling. They didn't know the doorway was already blocked. Survivors described the moment when the pressure of the crowd shifted from forward motion to collapse. Bodies packed so tightly that no one could raise their arms, people being lifted off their feet, then pulled under. It happened in seconds. Some were pulled out by others, friends grabbing arms, strangers dragging bodies into the open air. A bartender jumped through a smashed window to escape. Others followed. One patron used his elbow to break out a pane of glass and clear a gap large enough for a few more to get through. Those seconds mattered. Most people still inside the building by the 2-minute mark would not get out. Outside, others tried to go back in. One man wrapped his jacket around his face and attempted to re-enter the front door after pulling out his wife. He didn't make it far. Another tried to reach a friend who had been standing near the stage. The heat pushed him back almost immediately. The toxic smoke, which included cyanide and carbon monoxide, overwhelmed nearly everyone still inside. Some people escaped but returned to look for friends. A few made it back in and out again. Most did not. There were stories of small choices that made the difference. People who took one step in a different direction. People who followed a stranger instead of the crowd. People who stopped for a moment, and people who didn't. The nightclub wasn't large. From one end to the other, it was no more than a few dozen steps. But in those few steps, time and temperature decided everything. By the time emergency crews arrived, the fire had made survival inside the building nearly impossible. Of the 462 people who had entered the venue that night, 100 were killed. Many died within feet of an exit they couldn't reach. Others had been closer to escape, but too late to take it. Those who survived did so with burns, trauma, and memories they couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been in that room. For them, the fire lasted longer than minutes. It would last for the rest of their lives. By the morning of February 21st, the fire was fully extinguished. What remained of the station was a smoking shell of broken timber and collapsed roof beams. The fire had burned hot enough to cause the entire building to fail. Only the concrete slab beneath it held its shape. Just beyond the police line, family members and friends had already begun to arrive. Some came because their loved ones had not returned home. Others had heard the news and knew someone who had planned to be at the show. Phone calls went unanswered. Cars were still parked in the lot. Hospitals were full of patients with no identification. Throughout the morning, people gathered outside trauma centers, police stations, and the perimeter of the scene, looking for information that wasn't yet available. Medical staff had been working overnight to stabilize the injured. Dozens of victims had suffered burns covering large portions of their bodies. Others had collapsed lungs, crushed limbs, and respiratory damage from smoke and chemical exposure. Some were sedated. Others remained unconscious. Identification in many cases wasn't possible. Burned wallets, missing phones, and damaged faces made routine steps impossible. Family members were asked to describe tattoos, piercings, old injuries, or anything else that might help. DNA samples were taken from parents and siblings. Dental records were requested. No list of the dead had been released by the end of the first day. The number being reported, close to 100, remained unconfirmed in official statements. Recovery crews were still working through the interior of the structure. The floor was unstable, and much of the roof had collapsed onto the stage and entrance area. Victims were being located slowly, carefully, and often in places where they had died in close proximity to others. Some bodies were burned beyond visual recognition. Several had no usable identification left. Notifications were made in person, not by phone. Officers were sent to homes, often accompanied by clergy or crisis teams. Families who had waited more than a day received the knock they had hoped wouldn't come. In some cases, they were notified in hospital waiting rooms, where they had remained for hours. There were no explanations offered, only confirmation. Inside the building, recovery crews found victims concentrated near the main entrance. Many were within steps of the door. Others had fallen inside secondary exits, unable to reach the open air before losing consciousness. Autopsy reports would later confirm that most had died from inhalation and thermal injury, not from structural collapse. It had happened fast. for most too fast to adapt. Temporary morgues were established. The state medical examiner's office received support from federal forensic teams experienced in disaster victim identification. Each case took time. There was no way to accelerate the process without risking errors. Family members remained in limbo for hours, sometimes days, before getting final word. While the physical recovery continued, attention turned toward the circumstances that had allowed the fire to happen. Local reporters began asking basic questions about the building's safety features. The absence of a fire alarm system was noted early. Survivors had confirmed that no sprinkler system had activated. Questions were raised about the wall and ceiling materials, about the exits, and about the number of people inside. Officials from the town of West Warwick offered limited statements in the first few days. The Durderian brothers, owners of the club, released a written message expressing sorrow and promising to cooperate with the investigation. Members of the band issued their own statements. Public appearances were postponed. Journalists began reviewing permit records and speaking with witnesses. It did not take long for the fire to be understood not just as a tragedy, but as a series of compounded failures. Foam insulation that had been added for soundproofing was not fire-rated. The pyrotechnics used by Great White's tour manager had not been cleared with the fire department. The venue had been over capacity. Some exits had been poorly marked or partially blocked. There were no warning systems in place inside the building when the fire began. For the families of the victims, that information arrived gradually, in fragments, often from the media rather than from official briefings. It did not provide comfort. It confirmed that the loss they had experienced was not the result of a freak accident. It had been allowed to happen. In the town, a makeshift memorial was created along the fence at the edge of the property. Posters, flowers, handwritten notes, candles, and photographs were taped to the metal barrier. Volunteers stood nearby handing out water and answering questions where they could. A list of names began to circulate. By the third day, more than 90 had been confirmed. 4 more would die in the following weeks from injuries sustained during the fire. By the end of the week, Rhode Island had experienced the deadliest fire in its history. Funeral homes were overwhelmed. A mass memorial was planned at a local college campus. Counseling lines were opened. Hospitals remained at capacity. The full investigation was underway. But for the people who had waited outside emergency rooms, stared at the site through police tape, or searched for a name that never appeared on the list of survivors, the investigation was not their focus. They had already received their answer. The investigation into the fire at the station began before the last bodies had even been removed from the scene. From the start, it was clear this had not been an unpredictable accident. It was a structure fire, but one that had escalated with unusual speed and had been made far worse by a series of human decisions, system failures, and avoidable conditions. The Rhode Island State Fire Marshal's Office took the lead, with federal support from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF. Their first focus was technical, identifying the origin of the fire, tracking its path, and confirming the materials involved. They examined the remains of the stage, the ceiling foam, the placement of pyrotechnic devices, and the condition of the exits. The conclusion came quickly. The fire had started with the ignition of polyurethane foam mounted to the walls and ceiling near the stage. It had spread within seconds because of the foam's high flammability. No sprinkler system was present. The fire alarm system had not been installed. Exit signage was either missing or unlit. The crowd had exceeded posted occupancy limits. Responsibility was harder to assign. The Durderian brothers, Jeffrey and Michael, owned the station. They had managed the venue since 2000. Michael worked more on site. Jeffrey, a local television reporter, was often off premises. The foam, egg crate, and flat black polyurethane had been added as a cost-saving soundproofing measure. They later said they had no idea it was hazardous, but it had never been inspected, and there was no permit. They had not reported its installation to fire authorities. Great White's tour manager, Daniel Beachiel, had set off the pyrotechnics that triggered the fire. He had done so without a pyrotechnics license and without written permission. The Durderians said they had not authorized the use of indoor fireworks. Beachill initially claimed he had received verbal approval. There was no record of any request being submitted to the local fire department. In December 2003, nearly 10 months after the fire, criminal charges were filed. Beachill was charged with 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter. So were Jeffrey and Michael Durderian. Each charge represented one of the lives lost. The case was based on criminal negligence, the argument that the three men had failed in their duty to provide a safe environment and that their decisions, individually and collectively, had led to the deaths. Public reaction to the charges was mixed. Many believed the Durderians had been negligent. Others argued they had been part of a flawed system, and that blame extended far beyond them. There was also public anger at the state's fire code enforcement, particularly the inspections that had failed to flag obvious dangers in a space used by hundreds of people every week. The legal process moved slowly. Evidence had to be sorted, thousands of witness interviews conducted, and detailed fire modeling completed. Prosecutors offered plea deals. Defense teams prepared for trial. In 2006, Daniel Beachill pled guilty to 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter. At his sentencing, he spoke in court. He apologized. Many of the victims' families were present. Some accepted his words. Others did not. He was sentenced to 15 years, with 4 to serve, and the remainder suspended. He was released on parole in 2008 after serving less than 2 years. Michael Durderian took a similar deal. He pled no contest to 100 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years, with 4 years in prison, plus probation and community service. He served slightly less than that before being released. Jeffrey Durderian, who had less day-to-day involvement in the venue's physical setup, received no prison time. He was sentenced to 500 hours of community service. To some, these outcomes felt unjust. They believed the punishment did not match the scale of what had happened. 100 lives lost, families changed forever. Others believed there had been no malicious intent. The Durderians had not set out to hurt anyone, but they had made choices that put hundreds of people in danger, and they had not taken responsibility for those conditions until after the fire. Outside the courtroom, debate continued. Some pointed to the state's fire safety regulations. Others looked at enforcement practices. The use of flammable soundproofing materials was widespread in small venues. Inspections were often superficial. Fines were rare. Many similar clubs across the country quietly removed their own foam panels after the fire. Few admitted to having installed them in the first place. The station fire had exposed not just one failure, but a chain. The venue owners who cut corners. The performer who used unauthorized pyrotechnics. The inspectors who didn't look closely. The absence of alarms. The lack of sprinklers. The crowd that was too large. The system that had no mechanism for pulling all of those failures together before it was too late. In the end, no single person was held fully responsible. But everyone agreed. The system had not worked. The station fire changed fire safety policy in Rhode Island. That part happened quickly. Within months of the disaster, state lawmakers began reviewing the fire code with urgency they hadn't shown before. Gaps that had been overlooked for years were now visible, and public pressure left little room for delay. The first major update was straightforward. Sprinkler systems became mandatory in all nightclubs and similar venues with an occupancy of more than 100 people. Before the fire, that threshold had been 300. The station, which often operated just below that older limit, had never been required to install one, and never did. Under the new law, that would no longer be allowed. The legislation also required automatic fire alarms, illuminated exit signs, and emergency lighting in all public assembly spaces. Doors could not be locked or obstructed during hours of operation. Local fire marshals were given expanded authority to inspect without notice, and the frequency of required inspections increased across the board. In short time, Rhode Island had one of the strictest fire codes in the country for small venues. That was the local response. Nationally, change came slower. The National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, a nonprofit that develops fire safety codes used across the U.S., updated its guidelines after the station fire. In 2006, it published new standards for crowd management, emergency planning, and the use of interior finish materials like foam insulation. These were codified in NFPA 101, Life Safety Code, the primary document that guides building safety regulations across much of the country. Among the key updates, the use of combustible foam products for soundproofing in assembly occupancies was heavily restricted. Indoor pyrotechnics were explicitly banned unless formally permitted, supervised, and approved in writing. Crowd capacity limits were clarified, and new criteria for safe egress, exit access, width, and signage were introduced. But NFPA standards are only model codes. They don't become law until states choose to adopt them, and that adoption is inconsistent. Some states moved quickly to bring their local fire codes in line with the NFPA changes. Others delayed. A few still hadn't adopted them fully even years after the fire. Building codes, especially at the municipal level, are influenced by cost, local politics, and enforcement capacity. Sprinkler systems are expensive. Rewiring alarms takes time. Some smaller towns and counties struggled to comply or chose to focus on new buildings rather than retrofitting old ones. Fire safety became a larger topic in professional circles, among inspectors, fire chiefs, architects, and code consultants. But outside those communities, public interest faded within a year. Once the trials ended and the memorials were held, national media moved on. Coverage dropped. The urgency cooled. Some safety advocates worked to keep the issue in focus. A group of survivors and family members formed a nonprofit to promote code reform and education. They lobbied in multiple states, spoke at building safety conferences, and testified at hearings. Several survivors appeared in documentary projects and news specials, describing what they had lived through and how preventable it had been. They emphasized the small decisions that could have made the difference. A properly marked door, an alarm, a sprinkler system, a maximum occupancy rule that was enforced. But not every venue was changed. In smaller towns, in unlicensed spaces, and in temporary setups, dangerous conditions still existed. Just not always with the visibility of what had happened in West Warwick. The station fire became a cautionary example in training materials for firefighters, building inspectors, and club owners. It was referenced in fire academies. It was studied in design courses. It was included in every major rewrite of the life safety code that followed. But outside those rooms, few remembered the details. Rhode Island had taken its lesson seriously. The laws had changed. The codes had improved. But part of the damage was the knowledge that these changes had only come after, not before. And for the people who lost someone inside that building, that fact couldn't be written into policy. It stayed with them, not in regulations, but in everything that had come too late. The fire was over in minutes. But for those who lived through it, what followed stretched into months, years, and for many, the rest of their lives. Survivors left hospitals with second and third-degree burns, lung damage, nerve injuries, and scarring. Some underwent dozens of surgeries. Others were told they would never fully recover function in their limbs, or that their appearance would permanently change. The physical damage was constant, but it was not the only kind. There was trauma that didn't show. Many of those who had made it out lived with recurring nightmares, anxiety in crowds, and panic when they couldn't locate an exit. Some returned to work after long gaps, only to leave again. Others couldn't re-enter public spaces that resembled the venue. A few never went to another concert. Some didn't talk about what had happened at all. Others tried to talk, but found that those who hadn't been there struggled to understand. The grief among families of the victims followed no single pattern. Some were present at the hospitals in the first hours and never left. Others waited at home, calling names into hotlines, hoping for a list that would never include the person they were looking for. When the identities of the dead were released, there were no public ceremonies at first. Just bodies returned to families, funerals scheduled quickly, and memorials that grew quietly along fences. Dozens of families received confirmation not through official contact, but by absence. The person they were waiting for never appeared. Survivors from the same group sometimes couldn't say what happened to the others. Many had been separated during the fire and never saw one another again. For some, the last conversation had taken place moments before the band came on. For others, it was a glance in the crowd before the smoke cut off visibility completely. There was no closure that arrived with the court cases. The prosecutions led to convictions, but the sentences were short. Some families said they appreciated the admissions of guilt. Others called the legal outcome hollow. There was no clear point of resolution, only the slow recognition that those responsible would never face the same kind of loss. Over time, survivors and family members organized. A group formed to support victims and push for policy changes. Some became public advocates. They spoke at schools, at fire safety seminars, at memorials. Others chose not to speak publicly at all. The response was not unified. Grief rarely is. For some, remembering became a form of responsibility. For others, the only way forward was to stop talking about it. The distance between those two instincts sometimes created quiet divisions, not hostile, but unresolved. There were marriages that didn't last, friendships that faded, people who had stood side by side before the show and no longer made eye contact afterward. Not because of anger, but because they no longer shared a life that made space for what had happened. The community held annual remembrances, especially in the first decade. In time, those became smaller, more private. A permanent memorial was eventually built on the site of the club, with the names of the 100 victims etched in stone. It took years to finalize, not because of disagreement about whether it should exist, but because of how to do it right. When it opened, many came quietly. Some had never returned to the location until that day. The survivors did not form a single group. They carried different versions of what happened. Some had made it out through a side door. Others had been pulled from a pile at the front. Some had gone back in and couldn't reach the person they were looking for. Those details stayed personal. They didn't always translate. What they had in common was not how they got out, but what came after. The long, uneven process of living with something most people would never see. The fire was documented, prosecuted, legislated, and studied. But for those who had been inside the room, it did not become something they remembered. It became something that remained. In the days immediately after the fire, coverage was widespread. Major news networks broadcast footage from the scene, much of it captured by a local television crew that had been inside the club when the fire started. The video, which showed the crowd cheering, the ignition of the pyrotechnics, and the first signs of panic, was aired nationally. The scale of the tragedy, 100 dead, more than 200 injured, made it one of the worst fires in U.S. history. Then it disappeared. National coverage shifted within a week. By early March, the war in Iraq had begun to dominate headlines. News cycles moved on. Local coverage in Rhode Island continued, especially as investigations unfolded and legal proceedings began. But outside New England, public attention faded quickly. Unlike other major disasters, the station fire did not lead to sustained national discussion. It didn't result in widely recognized commemorations, no federal observance day, and no significant long-term media series. It remained in the memory of the community, but not in the national narrative. It wasn't taught in most schools. It wasn't included in broader conversations about disaster response. There was no central figure to carry the story forward. No survivor became a national spokesperson. No public official tied their legacy to the event. There were no best-selling memoirs and no national telethon. The people affected were mostly private citizens. Many declined interviews. Some chose not to speak about what happened at all. The footage was archived. Reports were published. A few documentaries were made, mostly by local journalists or independent filmmakers. They told the story carefully, often focusing on those who were in the room or who lost someone that night. But the audience was limited. Public tragedies often become national symbols when they attach to a broader conflict or when they unfold on a national stage. The station fire didn't. It wasn't about ideology. It wasn't terrorism. It wasn't a high-profile celebrity event. It involved a local venue, a mid-level rock band, and a town most Americans couldn't find on a map. There were no politics to fight about, no partisan sides to take. The causes were technical and bureaucratic: cheap insulation, a missing alarm, no sprinkler system, a permit that was never filed. The losses were devastating but quiet. They didn't become images repeated every year. They became photographs in scrapbooks, names on stone, people who were known to their neighbors and missed by their families, but not recited at a national level. In professional spaces, fire departments, building inspector trainings, safety conferences, the station fire was studied closely. The footage, forensic data, and survivor testimony became part of how future inspectors were trained. Code changes in Rhode Island were recognized across the country. Some states adopted reforms. Others didn't. But public memory is not shaped only by policy. It's shaped by repetition. And the station fire wasn't repeated. Not in media cycles, not in school curriculums, and not in national remembrance. For those who were there, this didn't make the loss feel smaller. It made it feel more invisible. They watched other tragedies gain attention year after year. Sometimes with fewer victims, sometimes with more. They understood the difference wasn't in the scale. It was in the visibility. Some called it a quiet disaster. Not because it was small, but because it was localized, and those who lived it didn't ask for a spotlight. They asked for truth, for change, and for the memory of the victims to last where it mattered most, among the people who knew them, and in the systems that failed them. And they knew that if that didn't happen, it would happen again. In the years that followed the fire, no single moment marked its end. There was no final court decision that closed the case, no day when the pain stopped, no public event that said the story was over. But things changed gradually and often outside the spotlight. The first was the memorial. For a long time, the site of the fire remained untouched. The land where the station once stood was fenced off quiet. Grass grew between the debris. People left flowers and crosses. Some came to stand silently at the edge. Others couldn't bring themselves to go back. The land remained in private hands for several years, and progress toward a formal memorial was slow. There were disputes about ownership, funding, and how to move forward without reopening old wounds. Eventually, the Station Fire Memorial Foundation was formed. It included survivors, family members, and local volunteers. They worked steadily without fanfare to raise money, secure the land, and design a permanent place to honor the dead. The goal wasn't spectacle. It was recognition. The memorial opened in 2017, 14 years after the fire. 100 engraved stones form a circle, one for each victim. Their names are arranged not by hierarchy or fame, but side by side, the way they had stood that night. There are benches, flowers, a place to sit. The design is simple, deliberate, and quiet. No admission is charged. No tours are given. It's not a tourist site. It's a space for reflection, built not by institutions, but by the people who stayed. Some of the survivors became advocates. They spoke at fire safety conferences. They shared their experiences with state legislators considering code reforms. Others worked with local governments to improve enforcement of existing laws. They didn't try to make the story bigger than it was. They tried to make it useful. Their work contributed to changes that few people outside the field ever hear about. Improved crowd management protocols, clearer egress design in public venues, more routine inspections of foam insulation and temporary structures. Some states rewrote their event permit procedures. Others required indoor venues to post visible exit maps. These changes weren't marketed as a direct result of the station fire, but they were. The footage from that night, recorded by the local news team, became part of training materials used nationwide. Not to shock, but to show. Fire academies, building inspectors, event planners, and emergency managers studied the timeline. From ignition to full involvement, the fire moved through the structure in less than 5 minutes. It became a textbook example of how fast public safety can fail, even when the risks seem small. The band Great White continued to tour, though under different lineups. Some venues canceled bookings. Others didn't. Survivors sometimes found themselves driving past places that looked like the station. Low ceilings, no alarms, tight corners, and chose not to go in. The fire made them see spaces differently. It changed what felt safe. That stayed with them. Some kept telling the story. Others stopped. That was personal. There was no expectation that anyone carry the memory for anyone else. The people who lost someone or who walked out alone didn't always identify as victims. They identified as people who lived through something and were still living with it. That difference mattered. What the station fire left behind wasn't only a death toll. It was a blueprint of what happens when warning signs are missed, when regulations are ignored, when people are treated as customers but not as lives. The blueprint wasn't written in law. It was written in memory. For most people, the station fire is no longer present. But it is there, in the way exit signs are installed, in how fire marshals read plans, in the calculations engineers make when drawing public rooms. It's there in the split-second decision someone makes to point out a blocked door, or to leave a room that feels too full. Most people don't know where that instinct came from, but it came from here. 100 people went to a concert and didn't come home. That fact does not grow distant with time. It doesn't become easier to understand the further away you are from the night it happened. It stays where it was, sudden, complete, and irreversible. The station fire was not a mystery. The timeline is known. The decisions that led to it were documented. The materials used. The permits not filed. The exits blocked or ignored. The failure of oversight. It wasn't one person or one moment. It was a sequence of small choices and larger systems that, together, made a deadly situation inevitable. No one who survived has forgotten what it felt like in that room. The heat. The silence that dropped just before the crowd began to move. The way the air changed. The sound of people trying to get out at the same time. And for the families who waited outside hospitals or who stood at the edge of the fire line hoping for news, those minutes lasted for years. Some came out of it with burns and scars. Others came out with nothing visible, but everything changed. There is no scale for loss. Some survivors said their lives split in two, before the fire and after. Others didn't say anything. They just kept going. The names of the dead are engraved in stone at the site where the club once stood. Visitors who walk the circle see them as a group. But each name had its own life. Each one belonged to someone who had plans, who had worked the next day, who had told someone they'd be home by midnight. Their stories did not end because they were in the wrong place. They ended because the protections they should have had weren't there. People often ask what lessons came from the station fire. There were code changes, training reforms, a better understanding of how fast fire moves, and how little time people have to make choices. But those are not the lessons families think about first. What they remember is who was lost, what they didn't get to say, the way their lives were divided by a door that someone reached and someone else didn't. There are few public reminders of the fire. It doesn't appear on national calendars. There is no annual broadcast, no federal observance, no landmark museum display. It is remembered in silence, in stone, in the way a stranger checks the exit when they enter a room without knowing why. And in that sense, it never ended. Not for the people who were inside. Not for the families who drive past that street. Not for the town that carries the name of a fire no one saw coming, and no one forgot. It was not the biggest fire in U.S. history. It wasn't the first time something went wrong in a building meant for celebration. But for the 462 people who were there that night, and for the hundreds more who lost someone they loved, it was everything. What remains is not the wreckage, not the footage, not the court documents. What remains is absence, and the obligation to never treat public safety as optional.